my name is Sarah Wingert. I'm a Regulatory Program Manager at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Headquarters and also our National Liaison to the Federal Highway Administration. I'm originally from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers St. Paul District, and as a project manager in the field, I previously worked under a funding agreement with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. I will be sharing a brief presentation on potential opportunities for the Corps to participate in early coordination activities with transportation agencies and NPOs, such as planning and environment linkages or PEL efforts. This slide provides a quick outline of what I will cover in this presentation, including a brief introduction to the regulatory programs authorities most commonly encountered in the review of transportation projects, our regulation that covers early coordination, some quick stats on the regulatory program nationwide, a discussion of potential early coordination activities and when such activities may be appropriate, and finally, a brief discussion of funded liaison positions and their potential benefits for early coordination. First, a quick intro on what part of the Corps I'm speaking to. As I mentioned, I am a program manager in our regulatory program headquarters. Our two regulatory authorities that are most often encountered by transportation agencies are Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Under Section 10, we regulate work and structures in or affecting navigable waters of the United States. The navigable waters of the U.S. are those waters subject to the ebb and flow of the tide, and those waters that are presently used or have been used in the past, or may be susceptible for use to transport interstate or foreign commerce, such as the Mississippi River. Regulated work and structures are defined in our regulations, with work including things like dredging, disposal of dredged material, excavation, filling, etc., and structures including things like piers, docks, breakwaters, and jetties, but not bridges, as bridges are regulated by the U.S. Coast Guard under Section 9 of the Rivers and Harbors Act. Under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, we regulate discharges of dredged and fill material into waters of the United States, which can be summarized as to include traditionally navigable waters, certain tributaries to those waters, and their adjacent wetlands, among others. So, have you seen the Corps Regulatory Program's mission statement before? Our mission is to protect the nation's aquatic resources and navigation while allowing reasonable development through fair and balanced decisions. Both parts of the mission are important. I also thought it might be helpful for the audience to see the Corps Regulatory Program's desired end state. The regulatory program aims to issue balanced, timely, and transparent decisions that are rooted in sound science and compliant with applicable laws. The Corps encourages early coordination because it can improve the efficiency and outcomes of the permit review process by allowing issues to be addressed prior to the submittal of an application. Our regulations include a provision titled Pre-Application Consultation for Major Applications that allows for early coordination, and I've summarized this for you on the slide. Our regulations indicate that the Corps shall be available to advise potential applicants of information or studies that may be required for a permit decision, such as an environmental assessment and public interest review, and the factors that the Corps must consider during the permit evaluation process. So what is a major application? Since this regulation includes references to informing the applicant of any required NEPA document and the public interest review requirement, our regulation implies major applications are applications for individual permits. More on this in a bit. We can still conduct pre-application consultations on minor, meaning general permit level, applications where there is enough complexity to warrant discussion, but we can't do pre-application consultations for every project due to limited resources. It also wouldn't be appropriate to conduct pre-application consultations on every project because it's not always warranted. So pre-application consultations typically take the form of activities like site visits, one-on-one or interagency meetings, and 404 NEPA synchronization work, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. Our regulations indicate pre-application consultations may also include the public, and in general should be brief but thorough, so that potential applicants may begin to assess the viability of the more obvious potential alternatives for their upcoming application. Our regulations also indicate the effort put forth by the Corps for a pre-application consultation should be commensurate with the likelihood that an application will be submitted to the Corps. An applicant can request a pre-application consultation, but the Corps may also recommend one if we become aware of a project that would benefit from doing so. We highly recommend having pre-application consultations with the Corps on applications that are anticipated to be complex. It is possible that some projects may require more than one pre-application consultation. The Corps may also recommend that the pre-application consultation takes the form of an interagency meeting. Finally, if a prospective applicant indicates the intent to submit an application that would require the Corps to prepare an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, which would entail an application for a standard individual permit, the Corps will identify a single point of contact for the application process. This slide provides a quick picture of the workload executed by the Corps regulatory program at a national level in fiscal year or FY 2019, with FY 2019 being from October 1st, 2018 to September 30th, 2019. It's a high volume of work. 55,000 written authorizations, which include general permits and individual permits, 24,000 jurisdictional determinations, which includes approved and preliminary JDs, 74,000 total permit-related activities, which in addition to permit application reviews, includes permit modifications, no permit required determinations, and compliance and enforcement investigations. Of the 55,000 permit authorizations completed, about 95% are general permit reviews, and this is typically even a bit higher for transportation projects. For those that are unfamiliar with the distinction between individual permits and general permits, let's take a small detour. Standard individual permit applications involve our standard application process, which includes a public notice, NEPA review, such as an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, a public interest review, and a determination of compliance with the Section 404B1 guidelines. As such, individual permit applications may include a robust alternatives analysis that could include both on and off-site alternatives. General permits authorize a category or categories of activities, either regionally or nationwide, that are substantially similar and would result in no more than minimal individual and cumulative environmental effects. For general permits, the public comment period, NEPA process, public interest review, and Section 404B1 guidelines determination is completed prior to issuing the general permit, so that activities proposed for verification under an existing general permit need only to comply with the terms and conditions of that general permit. As such, general permits are tools that are intended to streamline the Corps evaluation process for activities with minor environmental effects. So back to the workload picture. The Corps also completed approximately 17,200 pre-application consultations in FY19. To process this overall workload, the Corps has approximately 1,300 staff, which includes staff that process applications, administrative staff, and managers, as well as our approximately 72 project manager positions that are funded by other entities. More about this at the end of the presentation. Based on our workload and level of staffing, we have limited resources to conduct pre-application consultations and early coordination. As such, we encourage pre-application consultations and early coordination for those applications where it would be beneficial. And this will also be discussed in more detail a bit later. This slide discusses 404 NEPA synchronization, which is an early coordination process that could potentially be applied to projects that would require an individual permit from the Corps. Synchronization of the NEPA process with other required federal reviews is a best practice that is typically used when reviewing complicated and controversial projects. In synchronization, the lead federal agency for the NEPA review would coordinate with other federal agencies that are likely to require a permit or approval for the project, such as the Corps, in order to ensure that the requirements of the other federal agencies are taken into consideration early in the NEPA review process. The goal is to resolve issues early on that could delay the environmental review process in the future, or could result in denial of a permit or approval for the project being considered. For instance, synchronizing the NEPA review with Section 404 could prevent the selection of an alternative during the NEPA process that can't be permitted by the Corps because the alternative is not the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative, or the LEDPA. Concurrent 404 NEPA reviews may also reduce future paperwork for the Corps by allowing us to adopt or incorporate parts of the lead federal agency's NEPA document in our decision document. The synchronization process consists of a series of checkpoints that allows us to ensure that 404 requirements are being incorporated into the NEPA development process. The Red Book called them checkpoints, but you may also hear them referred to as concurrence points, decision points, or coordination points. Typical term I see used is concurrence points. Typically, the process includes 3 to 4 concurrence points, the most common being purpose and need, alternatives carried forward, preferred alternative, and mitigation. Other concurrence points can be used as well, such as alternative screening criteria, avoidance and minimization, and a conceptual or draft compensatory mitigation proposal. For the purpose and need concurrence point, the Corps is looking to ensure the purpose of the project is sufficiently defined to allow us to define the basic and overall project purposes for our Section 404 review. For the concurrence point on alternatives carried forward in the NEPA process, we are looking for the lead agency to carry forward all the alternatives needed for our 404B1 alternatives analysis. We can also dismiss impracticable alternatives at this stage. For the preferred alternative concurrence point, ideally the Corps would be able to make a preliminary determination that the lead agency's preferred alternative may or may not be the LEDPA. If we do make such a determination, it is important to note that this is a preliminary determination that is not binding on the Corps and could change if conditions change or new information arises that would affect the determination. The aim of the preliminary LEDPA determination is to give reasonable assurance that the lead agency's preferred alternative will ultimately meet Section 404 requirements. A final LEDPA determination is not made until the permit decision is issued by the Corps. As mentioned at the outset, 404 NEPA synchronization could be appropriate for a project that would require an individual permit level of review from the Corps. Since 404 NEPA synchronization process requires time-intensive coordination early in the environmental review process, often starting well before a Corps application is received and possibly starting prior to the NEPA process, it is typically reserved for complicated projects with greater proposed impacts and potential for conflicts. Some of our core districts have formal 404 NEPA synchronization agreements with transportation agencies, such as state DOTs, the Federal Highway Administration, and Federal Railroad Administration, which staff may refer to as 404 NEPA merger agreements. This slide includes a summary chart of such agreements from a survey I completed of core districts in May 2017 on the use of 404 NEPA merger agreements with transportation agencies. The agreements can be programmatic or project-specific, though all of the agreements listed here with Federal Highway and a state DOT are programmatic in nature. The survey found that 9 of our 38 districts had at least one formal programmatic 404 NEPA merger agreement in place with transportation agencies, while 5 districts used an informal 404 NEPA synchronization process for transportation projects. The typical thresholds for initiating the procedures in the formal 404 NEPA merger agreements were projects that would require an individual permit level of review, an environmental impact statement, and/or an environmental assessment. The formal agreements also have at least 3 concurrence points, with the most common concurrence points including purpose and need, alternatives carried forward, and the preliminary least environmentally damaging practicable alternative or preferred alternative concurrence points. Though these agreements were all initially executed prior to Executive Order 13807, these three concurrence points are notably the same concurrence points that are required under the Executive Order 13807 One Federal Decision process, though it should be noted that the preferred alternative concurrence point in EO 13807 does not mention the lead pub. Other concurrence points in the formal core district 404 NEPA merger agreements with transportation agencies include alternative screening criteria, avoidance and minimization, and conceptual or draft compensatory mitigation proposals, among others. This slide provides more details on an example of an existing 404 NEPA merger agreement between the core Albuquerque District, Federal Highway Administration, Colorado Division, and the Colorado Department of Transportation. This agreement has been in place at least since 2008, though the most current version is from 2019. While the Corps, Federal Highway, and the State DOT are the signatories, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are considered participating non-signatory agencies in the agreement, which the agreement defines as agencies that are invited to concurrence point meetings and are able to provide comment on concurrence point information, but official concurrence is not sought from those agencies on the concurrence points. The threshold for initiating the 404 NEPA synchronization process in this agreement is projects that would require an individual permit from the Corps and an environmental impact statement, or in some cases would require an individual permit from the Corps and an environmental assessment. Environmental assessment projects only follow the procedure if the agencies determine that doing so would be in the public interest, while considering potential impacts to waters of the United States, the range of potential alternatives, and the potential for environmental controversy. The concurrence points used in this agreement are the same as the EO 13807 One Federal Decision concurrence points, so purpose and need, range of alternatives carried forward, and preferred alternative. This agreement also includes a reference to agency coordination on PEL products and critical PEL milestones, such as purpose and need and alternatives analysis. Additionally, the agreement mentions a PEL partnering agreement signed in 2009 that acknowledges the commitment between the agencies to actively participate during the PEL process and defines the core role in the participation as communicating core needs to Federal Highway and the Colorado DOT, providing sufficient agency resources for participation, and reviewing documents. The 2009 partnering agreement is a brief, 3-page, non-binding working agreement supporting PEL and the intention of the agencies to engage in collaborative interagency PEL approaches. The agreement includes 15 signatories of various federal, state, and local agencies. This slide discusses the types of projects that are most appropriate for PEL and other early coordination activities with the Corps. Generally, projects that will require an alternatives analysis by the Corps are appropriate for early coordination and may also be appropriate for PEL activities. As discussed previously, the Corps standard individual permit process requires a determination of compliance with the Section 404B1 guidelines, which are actually regulations, a public interest review determination, meaning whether issuing a permit would be contrary to the public interest, and NEPA compliance, which is typically an environmental assessment, but occasionally may be an environmental impact statement. Under the 404B1 guidelines, the Corps can only permit the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative, and all appropriate and practicable measures to avoid and minimize impacts must be incorporated into the proposal. For individual permits, the Corps can consider both on-site and off-site alternatives. Individual permits typically involve projects with aquatic resource impacts greater than ½ acre per single and complete project, but the thresholds vary by region depending on the types of permits your district uses. If Federal Highway is the lead agency for the development of an environmental impact statement, then the Corps would be a cooperating agency if we have jurisdiction over the project. In our role as a cooperating agency, we could participate in early coordination activities commensurate with the anticipated scope of our review. So we know that projects that are likely to require an individual permit from the Corps are often appropriate for early coordination. What about projects that may qualify for a general permit? As discussed previously, the Corps completes NEPA compliance, our public interest review, and our 404B1 guidelines determination at the time the general permit is issued. And our review of alternatives for activities qualifying for an existing general permit is limited to on-site alternatives, which is namely avoidance and minimization alternatives. If Federal Highway is the lead federal agency for an environmental impact statement for a project that may require a general permit verification from the Corps, our NEPA role as a cooperating agency with an authorization decision will be limited because our NEPA obligations have already been satisfied. In these cases, our contributions as a cooperating agency on the environmental impact statement will typically be limited to ensuring the EIS contains accurate information regarding jurisdictional aquatic resources. For general permit level reviews, the resource costs of undergoing a PEL or a 404 NEPA merger type of process may outweigh the benefits. This is due to our limited role in the project, the fact that NEPA is already completed for us at the time the general permit was issued, and our review of alternatives being limited to on-site avoidance and minimization. In many cases, pre-application consultation may not be necessary for projects that are likely to qualify for an existing general permit. However, the Corps and the prospective applicant may find a pre-application consultation to be beneficial and appropriate for some general permit level projects. Examples of such scenarios may include projects that have multiple on-site alternatives that differ in impacts, projects where permittee responsible compensatory mitigation would be required, projects where the Corps would be the lead federal agency responsible for Section 106 National Historic Preservation Act or Section 7 Endangered Species Act consultation, or projects where the prospective applicant has questions regarding the Corps permit process, among others. This slide briefly discusses the Corps involvement with the One Federal Decision, or OFD, process and how it may involve PEL efforts. The OFD process for EIS level projects subject to EO 13807 includes opportunities for the Corps to engage in PEL efforts or other early coordination efforts as a cooperating agency. The Corps is committed to the implementation of EO 13807 and has been involved in the development of a few related policies, including the April 2018 Interagency MOU on the implementation of OFD, a Corps-specific guidance for Corps staff on the implementation of EO 13807 and OFD, and the February 2018 Federal Highway Working Agreement on OFD. For those that aren't familiar with the Federal Highway Working Agreement, it is a short interagency agreement signed by Federal Highway, U.S. Coast Guard, the EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA, where the agencies commit to working together to meeting the OFD requirements in EO 13807 for EIS level projects where Federal Highway is the lead federal agency. The agreement includes an example process chart for synchronizing the Federal Highway-led NEPA process with the environmental review processes of the cooperating agencies, such as the Corps Section 4.4 and Section 10 evaluation process. This example process chart references PEL efforts as a potential pre-NOI activity that the agencies could conduct. Also, the potential pre-NOI activities provided here on this slide are recommended pre-NOI activities listed in the Federal Highway Working Agreement under the Corps Section 4.4 or Section 10 permit action. These may include things like pre-application meetings to discuss potential alternatives, aquatic resource delineation methods or reviews, proposed impacts, and the potential permitting needs for the project. If possible, in the pre-NOI stage, it is important for the Corps to receive information from the prospective applicant that will assist with determining the likely level of permitting, such as a general permit versus an individual permit, since the level of permitting required will impact the Corps involvement in the NEPA process and the permitting timetable. If a Corps review would be required, the Corps should also participate in the development of permitting timetable and the purpose and need concurrence point prior to the release of the NOI. The Corps may also participate in the development of a Tier 1 EIS or studies involving the screening of unreasonable alternatives prior to NOI release. So these are just some examples of potential activities that the Corps can participate in prior to the NOI. slide provides a list of potential Pell-like efforts that may be of interest to the Corps. This list is not all-inclusive, and the level of Corps interest in such activities would depend on the effort's relation to a Corps regulatory authority. For instance, studies relating to the identification of impacts to aquatic resources, or the avoidance, minimization, or mitigation of potential impacts to aquatic resources would likely be of great interest to the Corps, since such studies may directly relate to Corps regulatory authorities. Similarly, the Corps would also likely be interested in the development of programmatic mitigation plans for mitigation of future aquatic resource impacts, such as plans that would involve the development of wetland or stream mitigation banks or sites. Depending on the potential for the Corps to be involved with the review of a prospective project, the Corps may also be involved in studies that would aim to develop the purpose and need for a project or screen out unreasonable alternatives for a project. And indeed, the Corps should be involved in the development of the purpose and need and screening of unreasonable alternatives if the planning project is to be carried forward into NEPA and the project is likely to require a Corps individual permit. To the extent that it is appropriate and necessary, the Corps may also be involved with the development of Tier 1 EISs and corridor studies. It should be noted that for all of these activities and for early coordination in general, the level of feedback that the Corps can provide will be based on the level of information that we receive. For example, if only general information is received, we will only likely be able to provide general feedback, such as information on our authorities and potential permitting requirements. So we discussed earlier that it is not possible for the Corps to participate in early coordination activities for every project that may require an application from us. While the Corps highly values and encourages early coordination, we have to balance early coordination efforts with our incoming permit application workload. If your transportation agency finds that it would like to be able to conduct more early coordination activities with Corps staff, one potential option to consider is funding a liaison position at your local Corps district. There are 3 statutory authorities that the Corps can use to accept funds from transportation agencies to expedite the permit review process, including Section 214 of the Water Resources Development Act of 2000, as amended, Section 139J of Title 23 of the U.S. Code, and Section 307 of Title 49 of the U.S. Code. Section 214 is a Corps authority that allows us to enter into funding agreements with non-federal public entities for the review of projects with a public purpose, while Sections 139J and 307 are actually U.S. DOT authorities that allow federal agencies like the Corps to accept funds from public entities that receive federal aid funding from a U.S. DOT operating administration for their projects or programs. It should be noted that Section 139J is restricted to projects or programs receiving funds from Federal Highway and the Federal Transit Administration, while Section 307 has no restrictions on which U.S. DOT operating administration is providing the funds. Entering into a funding agreement with the Corps could allow the Corps to dedicate one or more Corps district staff to the review of your agency's permit applications and early coordination requests. In addition to expediting the permit review process for your transportation projects, funding a liaison position with the Corps is a great opportunity to increase early coordination frequency and allow time for work on programmatic and streamlining improvements that the Corps may not otherwise have the time and resources to focus on, such as the development of a new general permit for transportation projects. You could also set regular early coordination and project check-in meeting dates with your Corps liaison. In fiscal year 2019, 23 state DOTs funded approximately 48 full-time equivalent employees in the Corps regulatory program, and state DOTs represented a little more than a quarter of our total number of funding entities. In addition to expediting application reviews, our funding entities and Corps districts often report improved and increased communication, the ability to prioritize project reviews, and the ability to conduct early coordination, including during the planning process, as the top benefits of liaison funding agreements. If you are interested in potentially funding a liaison position at the Corps, I encourage you to contact your local Corps district office. You can also find more information about our current funding agreements on the U.S. Headquarters Regulatory Program website, or you may contact me as I manage our funding agreement program from a national level. Alright, this slide concludes my presentation on opportunities for PEL activities and early coordination between transportation agencies and the Corps Regulatory Program. Please feel free to send any questions my way using the contact information provided on the slide, and thank you for your attention.